When two strangers posing as HOA enforcers tried to snatch my little boy from our yard, they didn't realize his father was a retired Navy SEAL. I saw the fear in their eyes the moment they realized they'd messed with the wrong family, and I showed no mercy. It was a quiet Saturday morning in our suburban neighborhood, the kind of morning that felt almost too perfect. Sunlight filtering through the tall oaks, birds chirping like a scene out of a postcard, the smell of fresh cut, grass drifting lazily through the air. I had just finished setting up the sprinkler in the front yard, so my 6-year-old son, Ethan, could run through it laughing like only a kid his age could, carefree and full of life. My wife, Sarah, was on the porch sipping her coffee, her brown hair catching the sunlight like strands of bronze, smiling softly as she watched Ethan dart around in his tiny swim trunks, squealing when the cold water hit him. We didn't know then that in less than an hour, the peace of our perfect little corner of the world would be shattered, that two men would walk into our lives pretending to be something they weren't, with a plan so stupid, so reckless, that it would leave them both on the ground crying for their mothers before the sun went down. I spotted the white SUV before anyone else did, rolling slowly down the street like it owned the place. Something about it didn't sit right with me, not the car itself, but the way it crawled along, stopping every few houses as though the driver couldn't make up his mind where he was supposed to be. Now, I've been out of the Navy for 3 years, but certain instincts never leave you. I spent 12 years as a SEAL, deployed more times than I care to remember, and you learn to read people, to sense danger before it ever truly announces itself. Out there in the real world, hesitation got you killed. Back here in the suburbs, it usually meant someone was lost or looking for an address. But this felt different. The SUV slowed near our driveway. 2 men got out. Both were dressed in khakis and cheap polo shirts with some generic-looking badge stitched on the chest. The words Neighborhood Enforcement Authority were printed under a clip art-style logo of a house with a picket fence. It was laughable, like they'd ordered the shirts from some bargain website the night before. They carried clipboards, which I guess was supposed to make them look official, but I've seen enough real federal agents and local cops to know the difference. These two, they screamed amateur. "Morning," the taller one said as they walked up the driveway, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. He was mid-30s, maybe early 40s, with a gut he was trying to suck in and a haircut 2 weeks overdue. The other guy was younger, skinny, twitchy, his eyes darting around like a rabbit in an open field. Something about him told me he was the type who thought carrying a clipboard made him important. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Yeah," the tall one said, flashing what was supposed to be an ID badge but looked like something a kid would make for a school project. "We're with the HOA enforcement team. We've had some complaints about code violations on your property. Need to do a quick inspection." Sarah shot me a confused look from the porch. We didn't even have a homeowners association. Our neighborhood had voted against forming 1 year ago after too many horror stories from nearby communities. So right away, I knew these guys were full of it. "Funny," I said slowly, my eyes locked on the taller man's fake badge. "We don't have an HOA here." The younger guy shifted on his feet. Well, we're actually with a new subdivision authority. Just started last month. Probably why you haven't heard." "Yeah, sure. And I'm the King of England." Ethan, oblivious to the tension, ran up the driveway toward me, water dripping off his hair, his little feet slapping against the concrete. That's when I noticed the tall guy glance at him for just a fraction of a second too long. Not the casual glance of a man noticing a kid, but something else. Something calculating. My stomach went cold. "Tell you what," I said, forcing a smile. "Why don't you leave a business card and I'll check in with the city later? If there's some new ordinance, I'll handle it." The tall one hesitated. Then he smiled wider, showing too many teeth. "Actually, sir, it'll just take a minute. We're supposed to document everything today." Ethan was standing next to me now, holding my leg, looking up at the 2 men curiously. "No," I said flatly. "You're not coming on my property. Now move along." That's when the younger guy made the mistake. He crouched slightly, smiled at Ethan, and said, "Hey, buddy, want to come help us fill out our form? Bet you'd be a big help." Every nerve in my body went on high alert. My Right hand twitched involuntarily toward my waistband, where, out of habit, I still carried. I felt Sarah stand up behind me on the porch, sensing the change in my posture. "You need to leave?" I said again, my voice low now, controlled, the way it got when I was 1 second away from violence. The tall one raised his hands like he wanted to calm things down. "No problem, sir. We'll go." But as they turned, I saw it. The quick glance between them, the almost imperceptible nod toward Ethan. I knew that look. I'd seen it on men in far worse places than this. They weren't here about code violations. They got in their SUV and drove off slowly. Too slowly. Like they wanted me to think it was over. Sarah came down the steps. "What was that about?" "I don't know," I admitted, watching the SUV disappear around the corner. "But I'm gonna find out." I spent the next hour pretending everything was fine, playing with Ethan, helping Sarah with some yard work, but my mind was a storm under the calm surface, the kind of storm that builds silently before it tears everything apart. Years of training had wired me to notice patterns, to read intentions in body language, to see the predator behind the mask. Those two men didn't just feel wrong, they felt dangerous, like the kind of guys who got desperate enough to do something stupid. And desperation combined with stupidity was the deadliest mix I'd seen, whether in war zones overseas or back alleys in bad neighborhoods. The problem was, this time they'd brought that mix right to my front yard, right in front of my wife and son. I didn't like unknowns on my doorstep, especially ones pretending to be authority figures. And most of all, I didn't like the way they'd looked at Ethan. There's a special place in hell for people who try to hurt kids, but unfortunately for them, sometimes hell comes early, and sometimes it comes wearing boots that have walked through places they couldn't imagine. I told Sarah to keep Ethan inside for the rest of the afternoon and lock the doors, no exceptions. She didn't argue. She knew that tone in my voice. I rarely used it, but when I did, it meant I'd already gone from husband mode to what she jokingly called mission mode. I pulled out my phone and checked the security cameras I'd installed around the property. Sure enough, I had clear footage of the two guys, their faces, their fake uniforms, the SUV, even the license plate. That was mistake number one on their part, rolling up on a military man's home like they were playing some 2-bit con game. I ran the plate through an old buddy of mine who still worked for the sheriff's department. He called me back 20 minutes later. "Plate comes back stolen," he said. "Out of Phoenix. Vehicle reported missing 2 days ago. Stolen car, fake HOA uniforms, showing up at random houses pretending to be inspectors, and one of them trying to coax my kid toward him." My gut told me exactly what this was. They weren't scammers looking for money. They were looking for something, or someone. And if they thought they were going to find it here, they were about to have the worst day of their lives. Another call came in. Not from my buddy this time, but from an unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail until something told me to pick up. "Yeah?" I said. A voice crackled on the other end, the tall guy from earlier. "Listen, man," he said, trying to sound casual. "About earlier, we just need to talk. We're going to swing back by in an hour, okay? No big deal." I felt my pulse slow down, not speed up. That's what combat does to you. Some guys panic when danger comes knocking. Me? I get calm. Real. Calm. The kind of calm that usually makes the other guy very, very nervous. "Sure," I said softly. "Swing by." Sarah overheard enough to know something was wrong. "What's happening?" she asked, worry flickering in her eyes. I kissed her forehead. "Take Ethan to the back bedroom, lock the door, don't come out until I say so." She wanted to argue, I could see it, but she didn't. She trusted me. She knew I didn't overreact. When the white SUV rolled up again, right on schedule, was ready. Not with a gun, at least not yet, but with the kind of readiness that comes from a dozen deployments where hesitation meant funerals. They pulled into the driveway like they owned it, same fake uniforms, same cheap clipboards, but this time when they got out, the tall one had a different look in his eye. Not the fake smile anymore. Something harder. Something colder. "Evening," he said, as though we were old friends. I stayed seated on the porch, hands loose on my knees, watching them like a hawk. "Thought you said you just needed to talk," I said evenly. "Yeah," the tall one said, glancing toward the house like he was trying to see through walls. "Where's the kid? We need to ask him a couple questions." That was it. No more pretending. No more fake HOA story. They wanted my son. I stood slowly, letting the porch step creak under my weight. "You got exactly 5 seconds to get off." "My property," I said quietly, "before things go real bad for you." The younger guy actually smirked like this was funny to him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of zip ties. Wrong move. I closed the distance before either of them processed what was happening. First rule of engagement: control the space. Second rule: take out the biggest threat first. My elbow smashed into the tall one's jaw before he even saw me move, the sound of bone meeting bone sharp and final. He stumbled back, eyes wide, before I swept his legs out and dropped him flat on his back. The younger one fumbled for something. In his waistband, maybe a knife, maybe worse, but he didn't get the chance. My boot caught him square in the gut, folding him in half like paper before he crashed to the ground, gasping for air. "Wrong house," I growled, grabbing the tall one by his collar and hauling him upright. His eyes were glassy now, his fake badge hanging sideways. "You broke my jaw," he slurred. "Keep talking and I'll break the other side," I said. "Who sent you?" He shook his head, blood running from his lip. "Man, we just needed the kid." That was the last thing he got out before I slammed him against the side of his own stolen SUV hard enough to leave a dent. The younger one tried to crawl away toward the street, but I yanked him back by the ankle and dumped him next to his buddy like a sack of laundry. Sarah cracked the front door then, eyes wide, Ethan clinging to her leg. "Stay inside," I barked, maybe louder than I meant to, but I needed them safe. Neighbors were peeking out of windows now. Good. Let them see. Let there be witnesses when these two idiots explained to the cops why they were bleeding all over. My driveway. But then the tall one made his second mistake of the night. He laughed. Actually laughed, even with his jaw swelling and his buddy wheezing next to him. "You think this is over?" he spat, blood spraying the concrete. "You have no idea who you're messing with." I leaned close so only he could hear me. "Buddy, you walked into the wrong yard on the wrong day. I'm not the one who should be scared right now." I kept my grip tight on his collar, my knuckles white against the cheap fabric of that knockoff polo shirt, the fake logo half torn from when I slammed him into the SUV. My face was inches from his now, close enough to smell the sour stink of his breath, close enough for him to see in my eyes that I wasn't bluffing when I said bad things would happen if he didn't start talking. Because the thing about men, like him, the small-time bullies who think they can hide behind fake badges and stolen cars, is that they've probably scared a lot of people before, probably gotten their way plenty of times just by puffing their chests out and talking tough, but they've never in their life looked into the eyes of someone who's been to places where men disappear for less than what they'd tried to pull, here, and that realization was dawning on him now like a slow, creeping sunrise, the bravado draining out of him as quickly as the blood running from his split lip. His buddy on the ground was groaning, clutching his ribs like maybe one of them cracked when I'd kicked him, his breath coming in wet, shallow gasps, and the neighbors were starting to come out onto their porches now, drawn by the noise, phones in their hands, recording, whispering, the kind of low suburban murmurs that always come when something violent intrudes on their perfect, manicured world. But I didn't care about them right now, didn't care about anything except finding out why these two morons had shown up twice. In one day at my house, pretending to be something they weren't, and asking about my kid like they thought I wouldn't notice the way their eyes kept flicking toward him. Calculating, the way predators do when they think they've spotted easy prey. Except the thing about predators is that sometimes they pick the wrong target. Sometimes they find out too late that the prey isn't weak at all. That the prey spent 12 years on teams doing things in places that never made the news, and that the only reason he's still alive is because he learned to hit first, hit hard, and never stop until the threat is gone. So I slammed him into the SUV again, harder this time, enough to make his teeth clack together like castanets, enough to let him feel the message I was sending through the metal. Talk now, or things get worse. And I saw the fear finally break. Through whatever tough guy act he'd been holding on to, saw it flicker in his eyes like a candle in the wind, and he muttered something, low, almost a whisper. We didn't know whose kid it was, man. And right there, that sentence told me everything I needed to know, because it wasn't random. It wasn't some spur-of-the-moment idea to grab a kid off the street. No, somebody sent them. Somebody gave them an address, a description, maybe even a picture. And these two idiots hadn't bothered to find out that the dad in the picture wasn't some accountant or IT guy who would fold under pressure, but a man who'd spent his entire adult life learning exactly how to dismantle problems like them, one bone at a time. My jaw clenched so hard it ached, because the only thing worse than someone threatening your family is realizing they're doing it for someone else, someone you can't see yet, someone who thinks they can hide behind disposable wannabes like this. But I knew better. I knew how this game worked. Cut off the fingers and the hand stays hidden. So you break the hand, then the arm, and pretty soon the guy holding the strings has no choice but to show himself. Who sent you? I asked again, low and even, the way I used to sound on missions right before things went very bad for the other side. But he just shook his head, jaw trembling, and said, "Man, you don't want that smoke." Which made me almost laugh, because I'd heard tougher lines from half-starved insurgents in burned-out villages. Men who at least had the excuse of fighting for something they believed in, while these two clowns were just small-time muscle for hire. And I told him very softly, so he could feel every word like a blade sliding between ribs. "You got 3 seconds before I make sure you're drinking through a straw for the rest of your life." And he must have believed me, because words started tumbling out then. Something about a guy named Rourke, some mid-level scumbag I vaguely remembered hearing about from my buddy at the sheriff's department. A guy into everything from stolen cars to low-rent collections work. The kind of parasite who thinks shaking people down for debts makes him a kingpin. And apparently now he was dabbling in something worse, something involving kids. Though the tall ones swore up and down they weren't going to hurt Ethan, they just needed to bring him in. Whatever that meant. Like those words were supposed. To make it better. Like I was going to pat them on the back and say, "Oh, sure. Thanks for clearing that up. Go ahead and kidnap my 6-year-old. No hard feelings." But before I could press for details, a shout went up from the end of the street, and I saw a black van turning the corner, moving fast, too fast for a residential zone, and every instinct I had screamed that this was connected, that whoever sent, Tweedledee and Tweedledum here, had just decided to send reinforcements, because the van braked hard at the curb and 3 more guys piled out, bigger, meaner looking, carrying the kind of energy that said they weren't here to talk. And suddenly, the whole game changed. I shoved the tall one toward his wounded buddy and stepped forward off the porch, shoulders loose, hands relaxed at my sides, the way they taught us to stand before a fight, because tension slows you down, and I was going to need to be fast. Real. Fast, since these guys weren't carrying clipboards, weren't wearing fake polos or nervous smiles. No, they were in dark hoodies and jeans. The kind of uniform guys wear when they don't want to be remembered later, and the leader, a thick-necked guy with prison tattoos crawling up his arms, pointed right at me and said, "That's him!" like he was checking a box on a list. And then they started up the driveway with the kind of swagger that told me they'd done this before, maybe a lot of times, but I was willing to bet they'd never done it against someone like me, never gone after a man who spent more nights than he could count clearing buildings in the dark with people shooting back. And as they spread out in a half circle, I felt everything go quiet inside, the way it used to before a breach, before the flashbangs and the shouting and the chaos. That perfect stillness where you know what's coming and you're already 3 moves ahead, because yeah, they had numbers now. But I had something better. I had a reason to end this fast. A reason named Ethan watching from a locked window. Inside the house, his little face pale and scared, and I promised myself right then these guys weren't making it past me. Not to the porch, not to the door, not to my family, because if they wanted a war, I was going to give them one they'd never forget. One they'd remember every time it rained and their knees ached from the places I was about to break them. They came fast, trying to fan out like they were running some kind of formation, but they were sloppy, telegraphing every move, and I'd seen better coordination from half-trained militias in desert towns. So I moved first, because first movers always win if they commit, closing the distance before the one on the left even knew I was coming, driving my shoulder into his chest with enough force to knock the air out of him in a single grunt, pivoting on my heel to let his own momentum slam him to the pavement, while the leader barked something I didn't hear because I was already spinning toward the second guy, the big one with the shaved head who thought his weight made him slow-proof. But heavy bodies fall harder, and he found that out when my fist crashed into his knee sideways, the crack loud enough to make the neighbors gasp, and he screamed. dropping like a felled tree, clutching his leg while I ripped the baton from his belt before he even knew he was disarmed. The third one swung at me wild, overcommitted, the kind of street punch that might work in a bar fight but not against someone who spent years training for worse. So I let it slide past my head and buried the baton in his ribs, short and sharp, like we were taught. Economy of motion, no wasted effort, every strike a message. And he folded with a cough that sprayed spit across the driveway while the leader finally stepped in, big, fast, maybe ex-military himself from the way he moved, but sloppy now. Angry fighters always are. And he tried to tackle me low, but I sprawled, my knee smashing up into his face as he came in, his nose going flat under the impact before he collapsed backward, clutching it. And now all four were down in various stages of pain and disbelief, because things hadn't gone the way they thought when they rolled up in their tough guy hoodies, thinking they'd snatch a kid from a suburban lawn like it was nothing. And the neighbors were shouting now, some screaming, some recording on their phones. And over it all, I heard sirens in the distance, because somebody had finally called the cops. Maybe Sarah, maybe one of the neighbors. But they weren't here yet, and these guys were groaning on my driveway like a pile of bad decisions, while the first two idiots in the fake HOA uniforms huddled by the SUV, looking like they wanted to melt into the asphalt before I decided to come back to them, and I was breathing steady. Not even winded, because this wasn't a fight, not really. It was cleanup. The kind of work we used to do after breaching a room when half the threats were too shocked to react and the other half were too stupid to give up. And I walked through them now like a man checking items off a list. One kick to the ribs here, one stomp to the knee there, each one followed by a scream that would echo in this neighborhood for weeks because I wanted them to remember this pain every time they thought about taking a job like this again. Wanted the word to spread that this house wasn't an easy target, that whatever Rourke or whoever had sent them thought was going to happen. Here ended tonight in broken bones and regret, and when the leader tried to get up, blood pouring from his nose, eyes wild, like maybe he was reconsidering all his life choices. I crouched next to him, calm, quiet, my hand on the baton slick with sweat and maybe some of his blood, and I said, "Tell Rourke he just declared war on the wrong man." And I brought the baton down on his knee so hard the crack silenced the whole street for half a second before his scream filled it back up, high and thin like metal tearing, because knees are fragile things, built for walking, not for taking the full weight of a Navy SEAL's swing, and he curled around it, rocking, gasping, nodding through the pain like maybe he'd deliver the message if I just stopped breaking him. But I didn't stop right away because messages need punctuation. So the next guy got his shoulders separated with a twist he'd never forget. Another got his hand shattered under my boot when he tried to reach for the baton. And by the time the first cruiser finally slid around the corner, lights flashing red and blue across the houses, the whole lot of them was crawling on my driveway, or lying on their backs staring at the sky like they were praying for angels. But the only angel coming was the one in uniform telling them to put their hands where he could see them, and I raised mine too because I've dealt with cops enough to know you always make their job easy when they show up, even if you're the guy who just turned 5 criminals into a pile of human scrap. So I backed off, breathing steady, while the officers moved in, guns drawn, shouting commands, cuffing the ones who could still walk and calling medics for the ones who couldn't. And Sarah finally came out then, Ethan in her arms, his little face buried in her shoulder because she must have kept him from seeing most of it, thank God. And she looked at me with that mix of fear and relief I'd seen before when I came home from deployments in one piece, and I kissed her quickly before the cops asked for my statement, keeping my voice even as I told them everything. About the fake HOA scam, the stolen SUV, the call saying they'd come back, the van full of muscle showing up like they were here to collect a debt. And the lead officer, a guy with stripes on his sleeve and the kind of tired eyes that said he'd seen plenty, just nodded like, yeah, this tracks, because the men on my driveway had records as long as my arm according to the IDs they found, warrants out on 2 of them, weapons charges on another, and while the medics loaded them up with splints and bandages and one guy howling about his knee, I stood there under the flashing lights feeling that old familiar calm after a storm, the one that comes when the immediate threat is gone but you know the bigger fight is still ahead, because somewhere out there this Rourke clown was going to hear what happened tonight, going to hear his little crew got wrecked by the man he tried to mess with, and he was either going to back off or he was going to double down, and if he doubled down, well, he didn't know it yet, but he'd just picked a war with someone who doesn't lose. The cops hauled the last of them away in cuffs, or stretchers in the case of the ones I'd left barely able to crawl, the flashing red and blue lights fading. Down the street until it was quiet again except for the distant hum of engines and the low murmur of neighbors still standing on their porches, whispering like they'd just watched some action movie play out in real life. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot, because while the immediate threat was gone, the bigger picture had just started to come into focus, and the name Rourke kept echoing in my head like a bad memory I couldn't quite place. So after Sarah got Ethan back inside and locked the doors again, I stood in the driveway with my arms crossed, staring at the dent in the stolen SUV where I'd slammed that first guy's head, thinking about next moves, because that's what you do in the teams. There's no such thing as just reacting. You plan 3 steps ahead. You turn defense into offense until the other side doesn't even know what hit them, and I knew that waiting around for Rourke to send more of his clowns wasn't an option. I needed intel. I needed leverage. And most of all, I needed to find this guy before he tried again. Because men like him don't take losing well, especially not in front of their crew. And humiliation makes people reckless, makes them sloppy, which meant right now was the best time to hit back, hard enough that he never even thought about my family again. So I called my buddy at the sheriff's department, the same one who ran the stolen plate earlier, and told him the name I'd gotten out of the tall one between the broken jaw and the baton to the ribs. And there was a pause on the line before he said, "Rourke? Yeah, I know him. Real piece of work. Runs a crew out of the south side, mostly muscle-for-hire stuff, collections, intimidation, some smuggling rumors, but nothing pinned on him yet. Cops been wanting to nail him for years." That told me 2 things. 1, this wasn't just some random lowlife, and 2, law enforcement didn't have enough to take him down clean, which meant guys like me could move in ways they couldn't. My buddy gave me a last known address, a bar on the edge of town that doubled as Rourke's unofficial headquarters, and told me to be careful, which, coming from a cop who'd seen what I did to 5 armed men in under 3 minutes, almost made me laugh, but I appreciated it anyway. I geared up slow, deliberate, like before a mission. Nothing fancy, just dark clothes, boots, a ball cap pulled low, a small backpack with some tools I might need if things went sideways, and as I zipped it, Sarah came into the garage, her eyes, tired but steady, Ethan asleep in her arms because the kid had finally crashed after all the chaos, and she didn't say don't go, didn't say be careful, she just looked at me like she used to before deployments, that quiet trust between us built over years of me leaving and always coming back, and I kissed her forehead and promised, "This ends tonight," because I meant it. I wasn't letting this Rourke clown or anyone he worked with spend another minute thinking my family was fair game. And if that meant going through every one of his men between here and whatever hole he was hiding in, so be it. The drive to the bar took 20 minutes, long enough for my head to get into that space it used to be in before missions. That cold, focused place where noise drops away and everything becomes angles, timing, contingencies. And as I rolled past, the bar once without stopping, I counted 6 vehicles in the lot, 3 guys smoking out front, one by the door with the kind of posture that screamed lookout, and music thumping inside loud enough to cover a lot of noise, which could work for or against me depending on how things went. I parked a block away, cut through an alley, came up behind the place where the lights didn't reach, and as I crouched in the shadows watching the back door, I thought about how guys like Rourke operated, all ego and theatrics, thinking they were untouchable because they had muscle and fear on their side, but fear cuts both ways. And I was about to show him what it felt like to be on the other end. Because I wasn't coming here to talk. I wasn't coming here to negotiate. I was coming here to deliver a message in the only language people like him understood. And step 1 was walking straight into the middle of his den with enough controlled violence that his whole operation felt it ripple outward before I even said his name. I circled around the back of the building, every step automatic, the kind of silent movement drilled into me by years of slipping through compounds where one wrong sound meant a bullet or worse. And as I reached the rear corner of the bar, I paused listening. The music inside was loud, some pounding bass-heavy track that made the thin walls vibrate, men laughing, shouting over each other, pool balls cracking against each other like distant gunshots. The smell of smoke and spilled beer leaking out through the door seams, and above it all that 6th sense, the one that saved my life more times than I could count, whispering that there were armed men inside, careless with their weapons maybe, comfortable on their own turf, but guns nonetheless, which meant I had to control the pace from the second I stepped in, because hesitation here would get me boxed in fast, so I tested the back door handle, locked, of course, and pulled a small pry bar from my pack, popping it open with a quiet snap before slipping inside into a narrow hallway, lit by a single buzzing fluorescent that cast everything in sickly yellow. Voices got louder as I moved toward the main room, heavy boots on warped floorboards, the smell of sweat and cheap whiskey thick enough to taste. And when I reached the edge of the barroom itself, I saw them, half a dozen guys scattered around. Tables, leather jackets, tattoos, the kind of crew that thought glaring at strangers counted as security. And at the far end, near the pool tables, was a man who had to be Rourke. Mid-40s, thick neck, shaved head gleaming under the lights, gold chain around his bull-thick neck, laughing too loud at something one of his men said like he owned the world. I recognized the type instantly, small-time tyrant running his little kingdom of scared followers, the kind who paid others to do his dirty work because deep down, he was soft where it counted, and the sight of him flipped a switch in me, the same one that used to flip before raids when intel finally matched a name to a face, because now it wasn't just some abstract threat sending goons to my house. It was this man, this clown holding court in a dive bar while his crew limped into emergency rooms with shattered knees and split ribs, and I wanted him to feel everything they felt before tonight was over. So I walked in through that hallway doorway like I owned the place, slow and casual, hands loose at my sides, not hiding, not rushing, and it took a few seconds for anyone to notice because the music was so loud. But then one guy near the bar turned, saw me, frowned, probably wondering why some stranger was strolling in through the employee door like he belonged here. And by the time he opened his mouth to ask, I was already moving, crossing the room toward Rourke with steady, deliberate steps that made men start shifting in their chairs, hands going toward belts, conversations dying mid-sentence as they realized. This wasn't a customer, wasn't a friend, wasn't anyone they expected, and Rourke finally turned toward me, his smile fading when he saw my eyes because I wasn't looking at him, like a man looks at another man across a bar. I was looking at him like a man looks at a problem he's about to solve permanently, and for one brief second, I saw it flicker. Across his face, that flash of recognition predators get when they realize something bigger just stepped into the food chain above them. "Who the hell are you?" he barked, trying to recover, trying to sound like he was still in charge. But I didn't answer. I just reached the nearest table, grabbed the beer bottle sitting on it, and smashed it across the face of the first guy who moved toward me, the crack loud enough to cut through the music as glass and blood sprayed together, and then the whole room erupted, chairs scraping, men shouting, someone drawing a pistol. But I was already in motion, flipping the table into the two nearest thugs, sending them crashing backward while I closed the distance to Rourke himself, ignoring the chaos around me because in every fight there's one target that matters and the rest are just noise, and when the man with the pistol got it halfway up, I grabbed his wrist, twisted until the gun clattered to the floor, and used him like a shield as another guy charged in swinging a pool cue, the wood cracking across his buddy's back instead of mine before I shoved the stunned gunman into him, and both went down in a tangle of limbs. 3 more rushed in then, all fury and bad footwork, and I dropped them one by one, elbow to a throat, knee to a gut, boot to a kneecap, each strike precise, economical, the kind of violence that doesn't waste time because I wasn't here. For a bar brawl, I was here for Rourke. And now there was nothing between us but 5 feet of stained floorboards and his own bad choices. He swung a fist the size of a ham at my head, but telegraphed it so badly I almost pitied him as I ducked under it and buried a right hook into his ribs hard enough to make him grunt like an animal, then grabbed the front of his shirt and slammed him onto the pool table, balls scattering across green felt as he gasped for breath. The whole place had gone dead quiet now except for him wheezing under my grip, his crew groaning on the floor around us, a few limping toward the door, rather, then get back in the fight, and I leaned down so close he could feel every word when I growled, "You send men to my house. You come near my family, and you don't finish the job? That was your first mistake. Your second was thinking you'd get a third chance." Rourke tried to laugh, some weak little sound like he was still the tough guy in charge, but it died. Fast when I twisted his arm just enough for his shoulder to pop and pressed his face harder into the felt, my voice low, calm, the kind of calm that makes men sweat because they realize yelling is for amateurs and quiet men are the ones you should be afraid of. And I told him slowly, so every word burned into his skull, that if anyone in his crew so much as drove down my street again, If a single shadow crossed my property line, I would come back here and dismantle his entire operation from the top down, starting with him and working my way through every man who thought wearing his colors made them safe. And as I spoke, I pressed harder until his breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, and his free hand slapped weakly at the table like he was already begging for air. Then I leaned closer and told him the part that made him finally go pale. The part where I explained in chilling detail just how easy it would be to make all of this disappear without a trace, how men like me had training that never made the news methods nobody could prove later, and that if he thought a few broken knees were bad, he hadn't even begun to imagine the things I could do when someone threatened my family. The bar was so silent now you could hear the pool balls rolling to a stop against the rails, his crew frozen where they knelt or leaned against walls nursing busted faces, none of them daring to move because they understood what Rourke didn't. Yet, that this wasn't a bar fight. This wasn't business as usual. This was a man with real war in his eyes telling them their whole world had just shifted. Finally, I let Rourke up, shoved him back so he staggered into his own men, clutching his arm, eyes wild like he couldn't quite believe someone had walked into his little kingdom and left him shaking in front of his crew, and I told him he had 24 hours to make this right, to pull his dogs back, to forget my address, my name, my existence. Because if he didn't, I wouldn't be coming back for warnings next time. I'd be coming back to finish it for good. Then I turned and walked out through the wreckage of tables and chairs like I hadn't just flipped his whole operation upside down, because leaving like you own the place is part of the message too. And by the time I hit the street, the night, air cold on my face, I already knew he wouldn't listen. Men like Rourke never do, and that was fine, because Section 3 was going to be the part where I stopped giving warnings altogether. I knew the second I walked out of that bar that Rourke wasn't going to let it go, because men like him couldn't. Ego wouldn't allow it, pride wouldn't allow it, and fear certainly wouldn't, because now he had to show his crew he was still the big man after getting slammed across a pool table in front of everyone, and sure enough, by the next afternoon I caught the tail on me, black sedan 2 cars back following too long, too obvious, the kind of amateur surveillance that screamed desperation, and instead of shaking it right away, I let them stay there, let them think they were being slick while I drove the long way around town, weaving through side streets until we hit the industrial district where half the warehouses had been shut down for years. Perfect place for what came next, because I wasn't about to wait for them to make the first move anywhere near my family. I pulled into a cracked asphalt lot beside a boarded-up factory, killed the engine, and sat there like I hadn't noticed them, watching in the rear view as the sedan rolled in slow, stopping 30 yards back, doors opening one by one until 4. Of Rourke's men stepped out, guns tucked under jackets, eyes scanning like they thought they were predators closing in on a cornered animal, and I almost laughed because this was exactly what I wanted, them thinking they were hunting me right. Up until the second the ground dropped out from under them. I got out of my truck, hands empty, casual, walking toward them like I didn't have a care in the world, and they spread out like they'd practiced this, 2 flanking wide while the other 2 came straight down the middle, trying to box me in. And when the one in front called out something about Rourke sending regards, I didn't even answer because talking time was over. And the next few seconds turned into a blur of movement and pain, the kind I delivered, not took, because before his pistol cleared leather, I was already inside his reach, slamming his wrist sideways so the shot went harmless into the pavement, my other hand snapping his nose flat before spinning him into his buddy behind him like a human shield, just as the guy on the left finally drew his weapon, too slow, too nervous, and his round punched through his own man's shoulder instead of mine. Then I was moving again, low and fast, boot snapping up under the shooter's chin so hard he left the ground before hitting the hood of his car and sliding off boneless, out cold before he landed. The last one on the right managed 2 steps backward like maybe running was an option now, but I closed the distance and drove him into the side of the sedan hard enough to rattle windows, forearm crushing across his throat until the pistol clattered from his hand and he slumped, gasping to the ground, leaving all 4 of them groaning, broken, guns scattered across the lot like toys. And the whole thing had taken maybe 12 seconds because that's how you survive in real fights. You end. Then before the other side even knows they started, I dragged the least injured one up by his collar, asked where Rourke was hiding now, and at first he tried the tough guy act, blood bubbling from his split lip. But then I tightened my grip just enough to make his face start turning colors, and Suddenly, he was very talkative, spilling about some old farmhouse outside town where Rourke holed up when heat came down, where he'd be waiting with the rest of his crew because apparently after last night he'd called in every favor, every extra gun he could find, turning that place into a little fortress. And I just nodded, memorizing directions, because that was exactly what I wanted. A single location, all of them in one place, no civilians, no cops, nothing between us but walls that wouldn't save them. The sun was dropping low when I reached the farmhouse. An old 2-story structure crouched at the edge of a tree line like it had been waiting decades for this exact moment. Windows boarded. In places, truck tires marking a churned-up dirt driveway that led to a wide clearing where half a dozen vehicles sat scattered. And even from the tree line, I could see men posted with rifles, smoking, laughing, not nearly as alert as they should have been for a crew that supposedly feared my return. And that told me everything about how Rourke thought. He still believed numbers would save him, believed walls and guns and bravado could hold back what was coming, and he was about to learn the same lesson a lot of people before him had learned, the hard way. Fortresses don't keep out nightmares when the nightmare knows how to walk through doors. I waited until full dark, until the last glow behind the trees dropped into blackness, then moved in silent, low, using the tall grass and the wind in the branches overhead to cover my approach until I was behind the first sentry at the tree line. A man too busy texting to notice the shadow gliding up behind him until my forearm cut off his breath and his phone fell silent into the dirt. His body lowered the same way we used to lower unconscious targets in desert compounds, so nobody heard the thud. And then I slipped forward to the next, picking them off one by one like the perimeter was nothing but practice dummies, until the outside was quiet and only the ones inside the house were left. Laughter and music floating through open windows. Like this was some kind of party instead of the last night most of them would ever spend on their feet. I used the side door, slipped in behind 2 guys playing cards at the kitchen table, both out before they even knew the door had opened, and then I was moving room to room like we used to clear buildings overseas, fast and relentless, leaving groaning bodies and smashed weapons in my wake until the only voices left were clustered in the living room where Rourke had set up like a king on a stained recliner, shotgun across his lap, 4 of his biggest guys around him looking jumpy now. Because the noise from the rest of the house had stopped, and that kind of silence never meant anything good. I stepped into the doorway slow so every one of them could see me, the man they'd been waiting for walking right into the center of their little fortress, and for a second nobody moved. Like maybe they thought this was a negotiation after all. But then Rourke lifted that shotgun and everything exploded. Except I was already diving sideways as the blast chewed a hole through the door frame where I'd been standing. Rolling up under his guard before he could rack another round, my boot smashing the shotgun sideways as I drove a fist into his jaw hard enough to knock him sideways out of the chair. And then the whole room was fists and elbows and broken furniture, as his men piled in and I tore through them one after another. Years of training and rage turning every movement into something fast and ugly and final until the last one hit the floor wheezing, and I was left standing over Rourke where he crawled backward across the carpet trying to reach the shotgun. His eyes wide now because he finally understood this wasn't ending with warnings or speeches. This was ending tonight one way or another. I kicked the shotgun away, hauled him up by his collar, slammed him against the wall so hard the drywall cracked, and told him the only reason he was still breathing was because I wanted him to deliver a message to whatever wannabe tough guys. He ran with after this, that coming after my family had cost him everything, that his crew was done, his reputation shattered, his little empire reduced to broken teeth and splintered tables, and if anyone so much as whispered my name again. In connection with his business, I'd come back and finish what I started with no police, no mercy, no hesitation. And as he slumped there, nodding frantically, bleeding and shaking and promising through split lips that it was over, I knew it was, because men like Rourke survive on fear, and tonight I'd taken every scrap of it from him and replaced it with something worse, something that would make him wake up sweating years from now, remembering the shadow that walked into his farmhouse and left him crawling. I walked out into the night then, past the groaning wreckage of his crew, past the vehicles that wouldn't be leaving this clearing anytime soon, past the sentries who would have a lot of explaining to do when they woke up. And by the time I reached my truck, the cool night air hitting my face like the first breath after too long underwater, I knew one thing for certain. My family was safe now. because fear travels fast in men like Rourke, and tonight I'd given them enough to last a lifetime.